The Chris Johnston Show.
Let's go!
Your number one destination for a behind-the-scenes look at the game of hockey.
Is this thing on?
Here's NHL insider Chris Johnston and host Julian McKenzie.
CJ, in 1999, the hottest song on the planet was Smooth by Rob Thomas. In 2026, the hottest thing at the NHL trade deadline is Rob Thomas, center for the St. Louis Blues. As of this recording, he has not been moved by St. Louis. Where are we at right now with a possible trade involving Thomas?
Well, it's Thursday morning. I think that's pretty important to tag on this, probably for everything I'm going to say. But, you know, it does seem as though if this trade is going to proceed, if they're going to find a new place for Rob Thomas, that it probably has to happen today, just from a functional standpoint. Look, at the time we're recording this, Colton Parayko is still not officially waived his no trade clause to greenlight the deal. St. Louis is sending to Buffalo, and that's instructive here because Thomas also has no trade protection in his contract. And so, I think we have to understand that it might take a little bit of time to think things through. The one thing Parayko and Thomas have in common, they both are signed long term. This isn't a player going somewhere for a few months trying to win a Stanley Cup in a new city. This is a lifestyle decision, a family decision, all those things. So, where it stands is that the Blues are open to doing it. The price remains extremely high, and it's got to happen in a pretty narrow time frame here because I think the Blues need to give Thomas time to consider his options. And what I can tell you with certainty is the Utah Mammoth are still at the periphery of perhaps making this trade. And we've already seen Utah make a big deal. They got McKenzie Weegar on Wednesday night from the Calgary Flames, gave up a pretty big price, but they didn't really touch their biggest assets, right? They traded 3 second-round picks, all of them in the 2026 draft, but they held on to their first-rounders. They held on to all their best prospects, and this is a team that's drafted a number of players in the first round in recent years. And, it's going to take 3 of those items, I would think, to get Thomas to Utah, but that is not dead, at least as of this recording. And so, this has the makings of a pretty intriguing trade deadline, Julian, because we're not just talking about older guys on expiring deals getting traded. I mean, when you have Weegar getting dealt with multiple seasons left on his contract, when you got a Thomas in play, Simon Nemec in New Jersey, a number of interesting hockey type of trades still remain in the offing here as we count down to 3 p.m. Eastern on Friday.
Hold your fire on the Calgary Flames, as I do have one more question on Rob Thomas. Any insight as to which teams have been checking in on him and could be at the forefront of trying to land him? Teams like the Buffalo Sabres obviously come to mind.
Yeah, the Buffalo option might be dead. That talk earlier this week was real, and it ultimately helped lead them to the place where they got the Parayko deal done. Some of the pieces that are going to be part of that trade when it goes through, and I do believe that Colton Parayko will ultimately waive his no trade clause to facilitate that trade, have been spoken for in this deal. Now, I'm not going to say everything's possible. Buffalo is in a spot a little bit like Utah, like the Detroit Red Wings, teams that haven't made the playoffs in a while, that have had good seasons, that have a lot of things that other teams covet in terms of future assets and are looking for, players to augment their lineup right now. I mean, that's where Buffalo's at. So I don't believe Buffalo's done, but I just don't know if they can circle back on Thomas and get to a price that makes sense. Those teams took a real run at trying to get something done earlier in the week and weren't able to do so. The Detroit Red Wings, I think, have had interest in Thomas. Not sure they can get quite there in terms of, the pieces needed to make that trade. Really, I think it's pointing at Utah. If it's going to happen now, and it doesn't have to happen now because Thomas has a number of years left on his deal. But the Blues, are in a transition phase. I think they'd like to, get things moving, turn over the roster. I mean, the mere idea that they're trading Colton Parayko, that was an important part of their 2019 Cup team. Still not quite 30 years old. Obviously, recently played for Team Canada at the Olympics. Has a number of years left on his deal. It's not a player they had to deal, right? But it's a sign of them turning the page, bringing in younger assets. I think it's Doug Armstrong, who's in his final trade deadline as the general manager, trying to turn over a younger team to Alex Steen, who's going to be his successor. Reminds me a little bit like what you saw in Nashville a few years ago when David Poile was an outgoing GM. He made a number of future-facing moves at that deadline to try to set the table for Barry Trotz. Obviously in St. Louis, they're going to hope it goes better than it's gone for the Predators, but I think the same principle applies here. So, if Thomas gets dealt, unless there's a mystery team out there at this deadline, I think it's going to have to be Utah. No guarantee it's going to happen, though. I don't mean to suggest that this is a 3-foot putt that needs to be completed. I think there's quite a bit to be navigated there, and ultimately, the pieces didn't fit when they've been trying earlier. I think that Utah bristled at some of the asks that were put forward in terms of the number of top regarded prospects that the Mammoth would have to put in. But this is another cool aspect of this deadline, Julian. Look at the teams we're talking about buying, right? The Utahs, the Buffaloes, some teams that, have not been in the playoffs in a long time in terms of their franchises. And obviously it's just a further sign of how things are shifting around the league this year.
Anything else you'd like to mention about St. Louis? I know I didn't ask specifically about Colton Parayko, but you were able to fill in the gaps with his situation. Anything you'd like to add on him or any of the other players who could be available from the Blues ahead of the deadline? Justin Falk is featured prominently in your trade board, for example. Ray Chen is also there. Anyone else you want to mention with regards to Doug Armstrong?
I think Falk's still a name to keep an eye on. Chen as well. There's certainly a possibility he's moved, but the reality is it's hard to do all these things concurrently. We'll see. Still trying to get the Parayko deal officially over the finish line. Not that it's a matter of negotiating the trade, because they presented him with the offer or the option to sign off on it, but that hasn't happened yet as of this recording. So, look, St. Louis is going to be a main character this deadline. The Calgary Flames are a main character this deadline. They made a big deal. Mm-hmm. The Rangers are hoping to be more main characters after already making the Panarin trade. Toronto Maple Leafs are trying to get in there. So, I don't know how much selling all these teams in Vancouver Canucks, I didn't mention, are going to be able to do, but there's definitely, there's more players on the market, I think, this year than there were last season. That's pretty clear at the deadline. And so that creates some intriguing possibilities. We'll just have to see what the next 30 hours bring.
I didn't even mention Jordan Binnington as a possibility too, with his name being out there in rumors. But yeah, of course, we're going to keep an eye on that. I do want to get to the Calgary Flames. We mentioned the McKenzie Weegar deal that happened. He was asked to waive his no trade clause, and he did. And now he's a member of the Utah Mammoth. All eyes now on Blake Coleman, Nazem Kadri, also featured on your trade board. Could they be gone by Friday? What are you hearing?
Absolutely. I mean, the Kadri name is pretty interesting to me because there's definitely been teams around it that he wouldn't waive, his trade protection for. I think there's still a couple out there, notably the Colorado Avalanche and Montreal Canadiens, who he would, be willing to play for, that have interest, but it's a matter of working out a trade with Calgary. I think, those teams, of course, are pushing for salary retention, which is a little trickier dynamic, in part because, it's real money going out the door, but also, Kadri is signed for 3 more years. So it's a big commitment in terms of tying up that cap space for that time. So, look, Kadri, this is the time to move him. We're seeing, as I mentioned, we're seeing more hockey type of trades at this deadline. It's not just expiring deals. And so there's clearly an opportunity at hand. He wants to go. I think he wants to return to playoff hockey, have another chance to win a Stanley Cup. And we'll just have to see if one of those teams can get something across the finish line. At this stage, I can't place one or the other as the favorite. I just know they're both still around those conversations, hoping something happens. Coleman, would expect him to go too, but, haven't heard him featured as much. I mean, I think there's been a lot of focus to this point leading up to the deadline, Julian, on centers. Robert Thomas is a center. Vincent Trocheck is still out there and quite available, mm-hmm. and Kadri. And to some degree, these guys are tied together in that, it's a premium position and teams are trying to secure what they can, especially those looking for impact type of players. So, we've seen a few more defensemen move, I'd say, to this stage of the proceedings here this week. But waiting for the dominoes to ultimately drop for the center market. And I think Calgary would like to see, perhaps if they can, what the market is, what a Trocheck fetches if he goes first. I think that might make things a little easier in terms of getting the Kadri negotiations over the line. But, certainly as we sit here, it's it's quite possible. It's a lot of veteran experience going out the door with the Flames. We know they've been reticent as an organization to do that, but sometimes you got to strike when the iron's there, and there's risk in holding on to your players as they get another year older and just assume you can do the same thing next year. It doesn't always manifest itself or work out that way. And so, the Flames and Craig Conroy are pretty busy right now.
I would think that with the way these prices are flying, the fact that they got 3 second-round picks in the same draft class for McKenzie, Weegar, and a prospect and a roster body, I think those prices might continue to go up. I'd be surprised if both of those players were still Flames by the end of this week. I think Craig Conroy is going to do everything he can to ensure that he gets that combination of picks and prospects for those two players.
Yeah, and look, he's well set up now. I mean, he's made the Rasmus Andersson deal earlier in the season. He's got a lot of draft capital already. That doesn't necessarily mean he has to, all be picks that get made. I think, I know you're there in Calgary, as you mentioned. You've seen the new building that's actually existing now. There's walls. There's construction happening. I think they want to try to have a better team anyway, I'll call it, as they make that move here coming up. So, this is part of, I think, what they're balancing is the bit of the teardown and the sales job, but also, how can they rebound and not stay down too long. And it's not always an easy path to go, but, having the kind of draft capital they do, I think will have value over time. It just means a little bit of short-term pain, at least for now.
One more Flames question for you before I move on. With Weegar out the door, what could that mean for Zach Whitecloud, who was also a trade possibility? He was acquired in the Rasmus Andersson trade.
Unless someone blows their socks off, I think he remains a Flame after the deadline. And Calgary's always had that view right from when they made the Rasmus Andersson deal. They didn't see it as he had to be flipped right away. They wanted to see how he settled in, and it seems like he's been a good fit so far. So, at this stage, I don't get the impression that he's being pushed out or they're just going to take, some mediocre asset to move him. He's still got term on his contract at a really attractive number. So, maybe we're talking about him down the road if the Flames are sellers again next season or what have you. But, it doesn't seem as though he's too prominent in terms of the rumor mill right now, just because, they've moved on from Weegar and you do need some players to play. You need to get to a cap floor and for any of these teams we're talking about as big sellers, it's not as though you can sell absolutely every player. You got to keep some guys.
Anything else you want to add before I go to Vancouver, another main character ahead of the deadline?
Nope, move on.
The Vancouver Canucks, anything you're hearing on those guys?
It's been a tough market for them. They've obviously had some discussions here surrounding Connor Garland. They did get the Tyler Myers deal done finally. That dragged on for a few days, but completed that trade on Wednesday to the Dallas Stars, which, met their needs because they got a second-round pick and a fourth for retaining on Myers and met the players' needs, which I think was important here because he was a longtime member of the organization and, a beloved guy. But, the Canucks have not made any secret of the fact they're looking to do a lot more than that. I think they have to be encouraged by what they're seeing around the league. In terms of other players with term moving, but maybe a little discouraged because it doesn't seem like they're getting a ton of action on their guys. Garland is an exception. I know a few different teams have been around him. I think the Bruins have been there. The Islanders have had some interest. I mean, I think Pittsburgh maybe just looked at it. Again, don't know if anyone is going to engage on a meaningful level to actually pry him out of there at this point in time. But he's been in discussions. We'll see how things develop with their UFAs. Sometimes those UFA players, in this case, to remind everyone, that's Evander Kane, Teddy Bluger, David Kampf. Sometimes those type of guys end up going on the day itself in the last hour or two for teams that are, basically maybe missed in other areas and just want to get some form of depth. So, I think that those players are all still in play to be moved. But, as of this recording, I think it's been a little slower than the Canucks had hoped. But, the usual caveats apply. One phone call, one change of mind, perhaps a domino falls elsewhere and opens up some opportunities for them. And certainly Patrick Allvin and Jim Rutherford want to seize on those opportunities. They basically locked up 32nd already, Julian. We should point out that, another loss for them on Wednesday night against Carolina, probably their one of their better games of late, but still lost 6-4 in that game. And, they've all but locked up the best draft lottery odds, and now they just want more draft picks to go with that.
Let's speed through some of the Canadian teams. I do want to get to the Florida Panthers very quickly, but we don't have to spend 20 minutes on each Canadian team. But what are you hearing with the Edmonton Oilers? Obviously, they trade Andrew Mangiapane to Chicago. Could they be doing more, or is that it for them after that trade and Connor Murphy being acquired earlier this week?
They've left themselves a little bit of wiggle room on the cap to, I think, hang around and maybe potentially add another depth, forward would probably be, the target there, depending on cost. I mean, they don't have a lot of what I would call, assets left to make a trade. They obviously gave up a first rounder, top 12 protected, to get Jason Dickinson and to get off Andrew Mangiapane's contract. They've traded a lot of assets at prior deadlines. I mean, they're all in. They're operating the way they should be. They're trying to win. They're basically maximizing everything they can get for their draft capital and with their cap space to get the best players they feel around their superstars and trying to take another run at things. But I would think a lot of the work is done. And, maybe it's smart. They got out ahead of the market because, a lot of the other teams that I would call big time buyers, the other contending type of teams, haven't maybe seen as much from them yet. I'm looking at the Tampas, the Carolinas, even Dallas, even after the Myers deal. I think the Stars are shopping still. The Minnesota Wild, in around Vinny Trocheck, seeing if they can get any other upgrades. The Colorado Avalanche, I think, are still going to make some moves. Some of those teams in the East that I mentioned that are maybe on the up and up are looking to make some splashes. So, Edmonton identifies that its players, paid the price, got them in. And, I don't expect any, there's been discussion around goaltending. Don't expect any moves there. And if anything, maybe we're talking about another depth addition. But, for all intents and purposes, they addressed the main needs they feel they had by getting a right shot defenseman and Connor Murphy, bringing in a third line centerman and Jason Dickinson, who can allow them to keep playing Ryan Nugent-Hopkins on the wing and just give them a little bit more of a spine, behind McDavid and Draisaitl in their lineup. So, they spent some real assets to get those things, but there's value in waking up on Friday morning and not panicking, right? They're not Chris Johnston on Christmas Eve, finishing up the shopping right before the bell rings.
You're a menace for that.
I am. I'm known for it. And look, lots of GMs are known for it, but Stan Bowman and Jeff Jackson, the Oilers front office, are not in that position because of the shopping they got done this week.
Winnipeg and Montreal, kind of packaging them together just because Winnipeg, they have some pieces they could sell, but seems like things could be relatively quiet. Montreal, they've been linked to a few centers, but maybe they don't have to do that much. What are you hearing about those two teams?
Yeah, the Jets, it's a lot of depth players or UFAs or guys like Luke Shen, Logan Stanley. I think he's an interesting one. And it doesn't seem as though they've made any meaningful strides to sign him, but they have invested a lot of time in him, and he's having a nice season after a long time. And so, we'll just have to see, if they move on from him. Gus Nyquist hasn't scored this year. I mean, they just don't have the kind of pending UFAs that are going to land at the top of the trade bait board, basically. And it's just a fact of where they're at. I still think that they're going to sell, but how much they sell, like a lot of the teams I mentioned, it's the desire might be there to sell, but you need buyers to take the items off your shelves. The Canadians, I think, are kind of a sneaky, interesting, interesting case just because they've been patient, right? And I think they are patient. I think they recognize they're probably not ready to win just yet. They haven't met the cup contention point, but at this stage, there's going to be some tempting things put in front of them. And I think they have to decide, do we go in on getting someone like Nazem Kadri? Do we make a pitch for a Trocheck? Do they bring in a goalie themselves? I mean, there's been some talk in their marketplace about that. And internally, I don't get the feeling that they've committed to it. I think they're quite comfortable, frankly, Julian, if it ends up being a deadline that's kind of quiet for them, if it passes without them, taking a shot at the upper deck, entering the home run derby here. But, but that being said, this is where we get to the human element where, we're down to the point where decisions have to be made. It's one thing to have that plan, but maybe if the prices drop a little on certain cases, do they wade in and do something? So, I would just say keep an eye trained over at Montreal, because, I think like a lot of teams in the East, they see opportunity there. Beyond Tampa and Carolina, you don't have a lot of established teams that have had a track record of success in the playoffs that are going to make the playoffs this year. I think that opens the door for Buffalo, Detroit, Montreal, the Islanders, even the Penguins to some degree to start dreaming, hey, not only can we get in here, maybe we, can go on a nice little run depending on how things break our way and what we do with our roster. So, I think the message out of Montreal is they're being patient, but I wonder if any human kind of impulses crop up and if they make a bigger splash than we're expecting by the deadline.
So we have the Ontario teams next. I'll just say this quickly about Ottawa. You can add if you want, but I'm expecting more of you on Toronto. It seems like to me with the Sens, I'm wondering with some of these asking prices, if they're ultimately going to get priced out. I mean, McKenzie Weegar's off the board. If Zach Whitecloud's going to stay, that probably might have been another option for them to add for another right shot defenseman. They were already entering this deadline with not the most bountiful of assets in terms of prospects and picks. I wonder if it just ends up being a situation where they make like one minor deal if they can, and then they just move on because they do like their core, they do like their team. It wouldn't surprise me if they didn't do anything drastic. So that's kind of my expectation with the Ottawa Senators. Again, you can add to that, but also I very much want to hear what you have to say about the Toronto Maple Leafs.
Yeah, I mean, the tough thing for Ottawa, they've just dropped so many games, and I know a lot of them you can look at. I know a lot of them you can look at and be like, "Man, we were the better team on the deserved to win-o-meter tonight, and we lost the game." At a certain point, you still lost the game. Like it is a get it done league to some degree, but it must be frustrating because we've made this point a lot on the show, but everything suggests that this team is better than it's performed, except for where it sits in the standings. But now you're getting to the point where you're flirting with, is there enough time left? Are we going to go on the kind of run it's needed to go in? So then, how much do they want to be involved on potential rentals and things like that? I mean, if there's a trade that they feel can make them better longer term, kind of like they believed with the Cousins deal they made last year, I think that trade always makes sense. Like if you feel like you're getting something that's helping you for years and years and years, I just think you do that deal whether you're making the playoffs or not. But, a lot of the deadline activity is still around players that are, it's a more shorter term focus. And so, I don't envy the position they're in. I don't fully have clarity, I'd say, on what they're going to do. But, part of me, if I was running the team, would want to give them a little jolt because, the playoff, based on the way they played, the playoffs are still in the possibility range, but it gets, with each loss, like the one they had to Edmonton, I know they got a point, but like with each successive loss or points not gained, it gets a little tougher. So, it's not a cut and dry deadline, I'd say, for them as much as it is for a lot of other teams.
Absolutely. What about the Leafs? We saw a tweet from you. I saw a tweet from you earlier today on Bobby McMann. While the Leafs continue to explore the trade market on Bobby McMann, they haven't ruled out signing him to a new contract extension. Yesterday's Kiefer Sherwood extension with San Jose, 5 by $5.75 million AAV, is a favorable comparable for McMann, although he likely has to come in under $5 million to stay in Toronto. What say you on Bobby McMann and the Toronto Maple Leafs?
Everything is on the table with the Leafs. I mean, truly, maybe not absolutely everything, but pretty much everything. And, as of Thursday morning, it doesn't sound like they have a lot in the hopper trade wise. I mean, it's not for lack of putting their prospects out there. The Oilers were in, I can tell you, on some of the Leafs players, but they valued Jason Dickinson more than Nicholas Waugh, who ultimately, they make the deal for Dickinson to the Oilers, but Toronto was part of those conversations. We know the Oilers had interest in Oliver Ekman-Larsson. They went in another direction there. The Leafs have been surveying the market for more than a month on most of their guys. It's the UFAs like Bobby McMann and Scott Laughton, and I'll get to your specific question at the end of this diatribe. It's players like Oliver Ekman-Larsson, Nicholas Waugh, I think they'd look at moving a goalie if something made sense. They have lots of depth players, whether it's Troy Stetcher, Calle Yarncroke, Simon Benoit, Steven Lorentz, and there's more. I mean, most everything is available here other than the obvious top of the roster guys that that's just not part of this conversation. And they don't yet know how it's going to break. And, it sounds like the offers have been slow. And so they're in danger here of, maybe not conducting the type of sale that makes sense for a team in their position and the type of sale a lot of those on the outside of the organization would like to see. Inside of that, there's a decision on McMann that's coming. From what I've been told, there've been a lot of discussions ongoing with McMahon's camp and the Leafs. I think things are in a good place there. But if you're Bobby McMann, you're sitting at 19 goals today. So one away from your second straight 20-goal season. You're looking at a UFA list of players that it's not long. Right now, he's the sixth best scorer among players due to hit the open market this summer. He's just seen Kiefer Sherwood get that $5.75 million AAV contract. I think that they're different players, obviously, in the sense that Sherwood is more physical, a better play driver. But if you look at the production, it's similar. If you look at their age, it's similar. Even if you look at their career path, it's similar, right? Sherwood took a long time to get to this point, and McMann is the same. He's really only his second full NHL season, and he's at age 30. So, this is there is a comparable there, except I can tell you the Leafs are not going to the Sherwood deal. I don't think they go above $4.5 million myself, but this is where the negotiation happens. And so ultimately the Leafs are doing two things. They held Bobby McMann at a Wednesday's game and they're having trade discussions on him. And they're also open to the possibility of signing him. And I do think we're going to get down to an either or proposition by 3 p.m. Eastern on Friday. As for those scratches, that was kind of a unique circumstance. We had Craig Berube in the morning before the game against the Devils saying to the reporters, no roster management stuff today for us. By mid-afternoon, each of those players was alerted to the fact they were out of the lineup, and they were out of the lineup despite no firm trade offers being on the table. It was just a reflection of the interest that had started to happen around them, some of the conversations management was having, and just being smart, frankly. Just, why risk someone that could be traded getting injured and that could take a trade right out of play. So, where the Leafs stand, as of right now, they haven't made a trade yet. They've got 7, 8, 9, 10 players more available. I mean, they're willing to move a lot of different guys, and I think they're hoping it gets very busy very soon because with where the season has gone totally off the rails. I mean, they've got to start restocking the shelves, start building towards a different future, and obviously moving forward from what we've seen on the ice the last few months.
Anything to get yourself back that top 5 protected pick, to retain, I should say, not get back. But that's essentially what that sounds like to me. Yeah,
maybe to at least keep it in the possibility range. I mean, either way, best case scenario, it's not going to be high probability. Like best case scenario, they get to like 15% chance of it being them landing in the first 2 picks and keeping their picks by winning one of the lottery ball selections. That's going to happen. But that's better than nothing. I think on more than anything, they need some assets back. And it's still an open question whether they'll get a first rounder. One thing I should mention on the Leafs is they have 3 retention spots and they have all kinds of cap space. Chris Tanev's done for the season, so he's eligible for season ending LTIR if they need his cap space. They enter the deadline with more space than usual. So they are more than willing to retain on guys to either juice a return or get a deal over the finish line. And they are willing to take back a contract if the circumstances make sense. For example, I can tell you the Leafs were willing to take back Andrew Mangiapane's deal, had they made a trade with Edmonton that made sense for them, and with all the other pieces. But, that was not a non-starter from the Leafs end of that arrangement. Ultimately, Mangiapane and his money go to Chicago as part of the Dickinson deal that was made Wednesday night. But the point is, the Leafs are willing to operate in that manner if it's to help move a McMann or to get a better price on Scott Laughton or, to get Oliver Ekman-Larsson to a new place. And so, the Leafs are in a really strange spot because, when you open the flea market and maybe the people aren't rushing there to try to negotiate with you on everything you have on the shelves, it's hard to know, where things are going to go. But certainly the Leafs have good players. There's interest in the sense people are calling, but I don't get the sense that they're fielding a whole ton of offers just yet.
Anything else you want to mention about the Leafs before I ask you about the Florida Panthers?
No, I think that's good for now. I'm sure we'll hit them hard on the other side of the deadline too.
Okay, the Florida Panthers, they look like they're going to be selling at the deadline. Sergei Bobrovsky's name has been thrown out there. What are you hearing?
Well, really the Panthers would like to sign Sergei Bobrovsky. They'd like to give him his last contract that basically walks him right into the Hockey Hall of Fame at the end of his career. And you can understand why. Things have turned out great there. He was a free agent signing that looked like a bust for a time, and all of a sudden now he's taken them to 3 straight Stanley Cup finals. They won the last 2. He was a big part of those wins. Tremendous goalie guy that they respect, but they're nowhere close to in the same ballpark on an extension. And so you get the news you get now that the Panthers just don't feel like they have enough juice, that they're too far out in the playoff race. They're pivoting to selling. They don't have a lot of pending UFAs. They do have guys like AJ Greer, who I think they should be able to move. But, Bobrovsky is probably the most interesting name, we'll call it. And it's a unique opportunity for other teams because, we don't see goalies get rented too often, but this would probably be a rental type of situation if he moved. And so I don't know how likely it is. Not most of the good teams are pretty set in that. Although, look, there are questions in Vegas, for example. Do they keep rolling with what they got? Do they count on Carter Hart getting healthy and him being part of the solution with Aiden Hill? Do the Canadians make that move? I don't think it's happening. Edmonton, as I've already mentioned, but there are these questions out there. Does Carolina look to make some kind of move to solidify themselves a little bit more in net? It's all possible. I don't know how likely it is. And the truth is Bobrovsky's only just been on the market here for a short time because the Panthers they didn't come out of the Olympic break, committed to selling. They wanted to, Bill Zito wanted to see a selection of games. He's seen that. They've lost more than they've won. And, I think the cold reality is hitting home. So, we'll see where this goes. But, ultimately the Panthers would most like Sergei Bobrovsky to sign a contract that they can fit under the cap, and he can be part of that group. Most of their players that have won the cups there have been signed to long-term extensions, but that hasn't been on the table. It doesn't sound like it's even possible for the deadline, and so we'll just have to see if they're able to move them by Friday afternoon.
Before we let you go, is there a team we should be looking out for, not named Utah, not named Buffalo, any buyer ahead of Friday's deadline that you're keeping an eye out for?
I'm going to give you a seller because it's the same spirit of your question. And, I think they've flown under the radar, but to me, the New Jersey Devils, could be intriguing sellers at this deadline, especially with the revelation that Simon Nemec is a player that they're willing to listen on, pending RFA, due for a big raise this summer, right shot defenseman, lots of upside there. I do believe there's legitimate interest around him and that he is a possibility to move. Beyond him, they've put some of their veteran defensemen on the block, guys like Brendan Dillon and the like, so they are a team that I think, maybe we haven't been that focused on from a national perspective that could become an interesting seller. Obviously, like a lot of the common denominators here, like the Torontos, like the Winnipegs, that this is a team that thought it was going to be better, that finds itself really far outside the playoff cutoff line as the deadline hits. And so, what do teams in that mode do? They usually sell. And, I know there hasn't been as much discussion about them, but I think that they have some interesting pieces. And especially if they're considering moving a defenseman they picked right up at the top of the draft a couple of years ago, who's a real player in the league. I mean, that'll be a big trade if it ends up going through. And so they're who my eye is on. I'd been picking Utah as my under the radar team when I get asked that question, Julian. And I was right, I think, because the Uyghur deal is an example of that. But now that they've made the Uyghur deal, I don't think I can keep banging that drum.
You could give a stick tap if you want. I kind of wanted to sneak in one final one, if you can. Anything on Steven Stamkos? Yes, one final question. Anything you're hearing on Steven Stamkos and the Nashville Predators?
Nothing has been brought to Stamkos at this time in terms of him waiving his no-move clause for a specific offer, but it does sound as though a few teams have kicked around there. We discussed the fact that he would like to go to a couple places where he feels he has a chance to win. Minnesota, Dallas, perhaps Tampa, perhaps New Jersey. Maybe it's part of a bigger deal. But, at this stage, it hasn't progressed to where, there's anything that's been brought to him. So I think at this point, it's probably we'll call it tire kicking or people just sort of poking around, seeing what's possible out there, but nothing that's made enough sense that he's had to make a decision for him and his family. So still feels like it's not going to happen, but I can't rule it out 100% because there is that interest, and he keeps filling the net this year, right? Another 30-goal season. Goal scoring, no matter how you get it done, that carries the mail in this league. It's very important for a lot of teams. And so, most likely not a trade happening by the deadline, but not one we can say isn't happening.
All right, CJ, we got to get you out of here. For a stick tap, thank you to everything, to you and all the other insiders for all the work that you've been doing this week. You have a stick tap. Give it to me.
I got a stick tap to the brilliant mind of James Duthie. And I would urge all of our loyal listeners to make sure they catch the sketch and the skit that TSN is going to lead off tomorrow's show with. We call it a cold open to the trade deadline show. Airs at 8 a.m. Eastern time on TSN and all the channels, but obviously you can find it online if you're not watching right at that moment. But I think we came up with a pretty creative idea. You'll see my acting skills. There'll be lots of GIFs that will unfortunately follow me around for my life now, or GIFs. Either way,
I'm Team GIF, but we're not going to fight over that today.
Either way, I haven't seen the final product, but I just know from the day we had it to shoot.
You haven't seen the final product yet?
No, but I know from the day we had it the final shoot that I can just tell it's going to be good. It's going to be funny. And, no matter what happens on the deadline day itself, we always have a lot of fun with it. We always try to come up with entertaining content because we can't control, the flow of trades or those types of things. And so I think we got a treat in store for everyone.
I'm looking forward to that and the continuing coverage across this trade deadline entering Friday. Thank you to everyone who tapped in on today's episode. Subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already. CJ, don't forget your lunch order when you're at TSN on Friday, because I will ask you about it early next week.
All right. I've already made the order. Don't worry, but I'll share it with you on Monday.
Awesome. Thanks so much for tapping in, everyone. Peace.
The Chris Johnston Show. Follow Chris on Twitter @ReporterChris and follow Julian @JKA McKenzie.
The Chris Johnston Show.
Hey, did you like the thing you just watched?
Was it hilarious? Was it informative?
Was it me losing my mind?
Possibly. Potentially. Most of the time it is. Hey, listen, if you like what SDPN has to offer, you should check out more of our videos and subscribe to our channel by clicking subscribe, or Steve will find you.